Hello and welcome to this edition of Table Talk, a series of conversations hosted by the Indian Animal Studies Collective, where we talk to scholars working on human-animal relations in various parts of the world. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I am Anu Pandey and my co-host is Susan Harris. Um, we will today be welcoming Sandra Swart. It's a great pleasure. It's a great honor to have her here as a guest. We will be discussing her latest book, The Lion's Historian, Africa's Animal Past with her, and focusing today on the chapter Beasts of the Southern World, How Do We Write African Animal History? Before we start talking to Sandra, I would just like to quickly mention that this conversation lasts about an hour, and we welcome all the members of the audience to pitch in at any point of time with their questions or comments. Please just switch on your microphone and talk, or put your question into the chat if that works better for you. So first of all, a really big thank you to you, Sandra, for agreeing to be here with us to have this conversation. We're very excited.
Who wouldn't want
And
to be talking about their work? It's fantastic. Thank you for inviting me. It really is an honor to be here. Thank you.
I thought today we could start with the really enigmatic opening statement of the chapter that we're discussing today, where you say that human animal history in Africa resembles an okapi, an elusive animal long familiar to locals, but unseen or misrepresented by outsiders. Could you maybe elaborate on how you mean this?
Sure. No, I like that. So that was my opening gambit to try to get people interested, because the thing is, normal human beings who are not us are really not interested in historiography. Nevertheless, we have to, sketch a landscape, an intellectual landscape for our readers, although they might resist this. So the hook was the okapi. And the idea is that, of course, this enigmatic, velvety, beautiful, strange creature in the deep forests of the Congo, Central Africa, proved an enigma. It was kind of this late imperial quasi-unicorn. Did it exist? Did it not exist? And the Welsh-American explorer, Henry Morgan Stanley, got wind of it, started interrogating local people. They mentioned it. And but they also used the same word for the domestic horse, the non-native domestic horse that was also there. So he got the idea of this creature that was probably, a missing link between horses of the past, Hyperion proto-horses, and the horses of today. And it really escalated from there. So it really became known as the kind of forest unicorn and things. And then Harry Johnson, who was running the place, got interested too, and he mounted an expedition. And of course, he went in really blinkered. He thought he was looking for a horse. So when he was finding tracks in the forest that were not round like the hoof of a horse, he immediately said, well, this can't be the creature. Didn't find it, unsurprisingly, because very blinkered. And so eventually they managed to get some skins, some replica kind of relics of it, which went to the British Museum. And there all hell broke loose taxonomically, because they didn't know what to call this. Was it a degenerate giraffe? Was it a horse? What to do? A Swedish kind of soldier of fortune sent a skull in, and they realized, look, this thing really isn't a horse. And then they debated over the name, what to call it, and eventually settled on sort of Equus ? Johnsoni, is named after this imperial administrator. And I thought that was rather marvelous, because it encapsulated exactly how African animal history has been treated, as though it has not existed all the time, long known to locals, and then forced into a kind of northern paradigm, the global North's paradigm imposed upon it. And I thought that's quite a helpful way for us to sort of quite subversively start thinking about how, if we write African animal history, how can it be different? How can it not be the okapi? So really just trying to liberate this animal. And then what I wanted us to do was follow the tracks of the okapi, but really see it, take off the imperial blinkers and look for the real living, breathing creature, the thing they eventually find and then spread out across the world in desirous networks for zoos and private collections.
Yeah, thank you. That really helps. The other idea that I wanted to talk to you about was your use of the term unnatural histories in connection with the history beyond humanity. What do you mean by unnatural histories here?
Um, I want to I want to disrupt a little bit the idea of natural history. I'm finding it fascinating where my book is ending up in bookstores. And this probably all of you can probably relate to this. Kim, Michael, Andrea, lovely to see all of you. I'm sure you can relate to this, but I go looking for my book all the time. And my students are very, very naughty. And they move my book around the bookstores and they put it where the bestsellers are. They take off the Elon Musk's book and they put mine firmly in place. But I'm finding it fascinating that my book is ending up in the natural history section, as we feared it might. Of course, it is not. It is unnatural history, highly human, at least co-constructed with human beings. So I just wanted to kind of trouble the term natural history by calling it unnatural, to emphasize that animal interaction with human beings should not be considered ancillary or subordinate to the animals in their pure state, whatever that might be. So often we read articles which grumpily has asides to, and we also see that baboons or lions interact with people, but in their pure state, they're doing this. I want to argue that in the Anthropocene, and indeed for much, much longer, the pure state doesn't exist. Animals interact with people. And it's only going to become more so as our world becomes hotter and more crowded and climate change forces us into interesting places. So that's why I like the idea of unnatural history. I also like it because I'm quite into not just the everyday quotidian interaction between people and animals, but also the kind of cosmology, the supernatural beliefs. What do they do for us in a spiritual realm? And I think that's quite a nice term, as well as annoying a lot of booksellers, I should imagine.
Yeah, and while you were talking about this right now, I was just also thinking about another set of terms that you use, which is about how you say writing multi-species history turns the known into strange. Um, is this also the sense in which you mean this? You know, the way natural history is turned into now used by you as
Exactly.
unnatural history writing, and
Well,
the
exactly.
possibility then of turning the known into the strange, so that it can be discovered in that sense or rediscovered in a different way. Then.
Yeah, I like that very, very much. No, well, exactly. So I guess one of the powers of we historians and anthropologists, Andrea, and people who are concerned with this is to show the seemingly natural order, the incontrovertible order, as both a product of the past that has changed in the past. And if it has changed in the past, it can change in the present and the future. So it's a kind of subversive attribute that is social scientists have, showing the long sweep of time. And here it's defamiliarizing the very, very familiar, literally even like Canis familiaris, our pet dogs. If you make that relationship strange, then it really makes you rethink these things that we consider so normal, commonplace, unchanging forever. No, they have a history. And if they change in the past, they can change again. I always think that's the sort of secret superpower of historians.
Yeah, and I, for example, teach a lot of Brecht because I teach German literature normally, and
Mhm.
defamiliarization as a very productive process works obviously
Yeah,
also in your field. Then, this idea of making the
yeah.
known
Fr-
unknown or strange.
I mean, from literature, from your side, I suppose, what was it, the Russian formalists, the people who really wanted to make the very ordinary very strange. Nobody does it better than Brecht. I mean, it's literally boring and then very, very not boring. So really, I suppose, one could aspire to Brechtian heights.
I was also really fascinated by how you break down the fallacy of the nature culture divide when you demonstrate that the forest was never the real home of the elephants, but just a place of refuge, and that in that sense they are refugees pushed into the forest. by colonial violence. Um, and this status of the refugee is, of course, something that anthropocentric history writing reserves for human populations. Can this
Mm.
shared refugee status engender any form of solidarity between humans and animals? Or do you think the species divide is too big a chasm for most people, including most people in academia and scholarship, to allow any form of solidarity to emerge?
I think this is a very beautiful question. I think this we need to think about a lot, especially as scholars of the global south. And we have to be really careful and sensitive and think about this. I would like a whole colloquium just devoted to this question because, oh, and just a little bit of background for the people who didn't perhaps get a chance to read, doesn't matter. It was a story about the last most southern elephant. She's called Opoort in Afrikaans, meaning old foot. And she lives at the southern tip of the kind of Great Knysna wilderness in South Africa. And she's really the most southern, but also the only free elephant because she's unfenced and she's utterly, utterly alone. And she's the last of her kind who were forced. There used to be, thousands of elephants in the Cape, but over time in the colonial depredations on the forest and the farmland, the elephants were forced into this forest where it was very unnatural habitat for them, but they learned to cope. Their cultures changed. They became able to live closely with people until it became final, just one. There's only one left. And so this is the question about refugees and shelter. And the words normally attached to people, vulnerable people, liminal people, people who have been marginalized, people on the periphery of power. So the word refugee has got really quite a strong evocative ring. And so, of course, I agree with you, we must be very careful when we use that, because the problem with radically centering animals, as you do too, as we do, is that we have to be really careful not to decenter people who have been decentered in the past for reasons of colonialism, imperialism, and not just, even in the pre-colonial period, also rendered liminal, wrong ethnic group, wrong gender, wrong sexuality. Lots of people rendered really on the periphery and on the margins. Now we're centering animals. Maybe those people are going to be decentered yet again. So particularly as scholars of the global south, we're pretty sensitive to that, I think. I think it's in us. And I think the way to really deal with this is to look for power and then to take seriously animals, people, anyone who has been silenced by not being in the archive, by not having their truth in the archive, by not even being sort of noticeable on those people making history, affecting change, and really taking quite seriously the power dynamics in a multi-species way. And I think this works. So, I know we all work with the holy trinity of the social sciences, race, class, gender, and caste, of course, but if we think about species, I don't think it needs to be, just the tail that wags the dog. I think it really can be integrated with those forms of oppression and those forms of intersectionality, as the young people say, as my students will be beaming to hear me say. Oh, damn it, I've gone and said it. But I really do believe it, and I think you just have to be really sensitive to it, because obviously we all know about the dreaded comparison and how one can fall into a really easy slippage and make terrible mistakes if you aren't sensitive to the nuances of power. Does that make sense? Because I think we're all grappling with that. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And this story of Oput was heartbreaking to read.
Mm.
Um, but also, picking up on what you were just talking about, it's also somehow strange, unbelievable almost, that scholars, even now, after so many decades where multiple doors have been opened, I tend to think of them as doors, so in the beginning, there was
Yes.
just the white male subject. And then gradually, in the course of time, the door was opened, and then there was a non-white male subject as well, and then there was a female subject, and then among all these doors, there were the intersecting corridors showing us that identities are not that clearly packed in, behind one door or the other. And you've mentioned in your text also about a colleague who would ask you, how's your little pony doing and stuff. And it's incredible. It's unbelievable that despite all these many doors that have been opened and acknowledged over the last few decades, and so many intersections explored, so many people in academia are still skeptical or even dismissive of the idea of animals as subjects and agents, in fact. Which also brings me to my next question, because where you talk about how culture matters, you talk also about what happened, what was undertaken as a well-meaning effort to ameliorate the situation of Oput by bringing more animals in, and how disastrous that experiment was. Because, of course, reintroducing species to a landscape from where they have been annihilated or where they have disappeared in the past is a project that does not seem to work in multiple cases. You write, of course, about the three elephants brought in from Kruger, who kept trying to return to the landscapes and environments that they were familiar with, that were a part of who they were. We've had Project Cheetah in India, which I'm
Yes.
sure heard about as well, which has been fraught with failures and really high cheetah mortality rates since it started. There have also been attempts to translocate individual elephants that are seen as rogue or straying too close to human habitats, and to get them away from human habitats and farmlands. And a lot of these attempts do not work. Would you say that the problem boils down to the fact that policymakers and most other people as well, for that matter, do not acknowledge that animals possess culture, that this idea is totally alien to most of us, and that they possess also an agency that emanates from their culture? And how would you say can this lacuna in understanding be addressed? Because it seems to be the cornerstone of the one that determines whether our attempts, our efforts to find ways of coexisting, ways of cohabiting with other species fail or succeed.
I find, thank you for that question. It goes absolutely to the core of the project, which is to try to demonstrate that animals do have cultures that change over time, and some of these cultures are co-created with our cultures. So this is profoundly important to the argument we're all trying to build. So, I mean, I like the example that you shared now with everyone, and I'd also just like to remind those people who perhaps haven't read this bit about another elephantine story, but the story of the pachyderm psychopaths. So what happened was, on the East Coast, where I'm from Durban, elephants were wiped out by the 1880s. The last one was shot for the ivory trade up the East Coast. And so about 100 years later, everyone was saying, well, we have these game reserves in Zululand. What we really need to do is reintroduce elephants because they're going to be spectacular, a great draw card to the game reserve, but also they're clearly part of the ecology. We need them, brush growth, all sorts of things, we need them. But at that time in the 80s, they didn't have the technology to bring the big elephants, but they did happen to have a handy store of orphans because the elephant population in Kruger National Park had exploded. And so they were culling, they were killing a lot of the elephants. And this created orphans. But what they didn't realize was that it was creating profoundly damaged orphans. So they relocated these little elephants to Zululand, to Shishlui Umfolozi game reserves, and they let them go. It was like the elephantine version of Lord of the Flies, because they severed from their culture. And also, having witnessed the death, the killings of their family, they were really scarred and damaged. So these elephants had no idea what to do in this foreign place. They interacted with cars, they chased cars, they damaged cars, they attacked rhinos. When the little men, the little boys came into must way too early because there were no older ones to biologically suppress or teach them how to cope with must. So they would try to mount and then attack rhinos, ended in the deaths of many rhinos. They then attacked people as well. And so they were killed. Several were killed. One, while it was charging people, trying to attack them, didn't know how to behave, didn't have the older matriarchs to teach manners, didn't have any of the older men to police society. It was then that they realized the power of culture. And they were able, with a little bit later, because of new technologies in darting and relocation, to move some males from the Kruger, older guys, and introduce them as a kind of task force to teach these youngsters how to behave, really to teach them their own culture of how to be an elephant, how to relate to other animals in the ecosystem, including people. And these Kruger elephants knew what they were doing. They knew how to relate to people. Kruger National Park's got, so many tourists. They knew exactly what to do. And so they were able to teach these little delinquents how to behave with very little recidivism. They became model citizens. And now, of course, there are far too many in Zululand. That's a different problem. So that just is the power of the culture. I want to tell the story a lot to people because what I've found when I say animals have culture, it's not only our friends in the human sciences and social sciences that react with, no, they don't, but also especially perhaps our friends in the natural sciences. And once you tell this kind of story and you can demonstrate that this has happened, we've done the hard work, we know, we can show them. It is a very powerful story to tell, the power of cultures. I think this is fundamental to conservation efforts. And this is why I really believe in the conservation social sciences, because we should be working together. It should not just be that there's one random social scientist with a clipboard asking people, okay, so how did that feel? No, we need to be integrated into the projects because we can really do this kind of work if we're given time and money, as scientists are, to bring a very important part of it. The other thing, so this kind of story would be useful, but there's another thing. For example, what people are becoming more aware of is who's carrying the culture. And so it might be when you're doing a cull of elephants that you don't kill all the older females. Of course, they're not fertile. Maybe they don't seem productive. Maybe they're not the ones that seem productive, but they are carrying the culture. They're like living libraries of Alexandria, carrying that culture, able to teach it to other generations. So people are also seeing animals slightly differently. So all of these things are really a long-winded way of answering the thing of how important it is to integrate the culture idea that you were talking about with conservation. But that's the final part of the answer. In this, there's tremendous hope because we also see that animals are not pre-programmed robots. We know we're living in a world that is rapidly changing. Culture is able to develop much faster, I mean, infinitely faster than genetic modification or evolving to try somehow match this rapidly changing environment, which is not only anthropogenically rapidly changing, but of course with climate change and bigger climactic and environmental issues. So both coming at them hard and fast. It is culture that's got these kind of behavioral reservoir of things that will allow animals to adapt more rapidly. Knowledge of what food to eat when they're in a new place, knowledge of how to behave with these strange people who are now farming, or now maybe they're tourists, or now they may be in suburbia shooting because you've gone into their garden. It's culture that's going to save them, not biology here. And that's why I think it's not just a sad story. There's a lot of hope in the story because flexibility is hope. And I don't think we have enough hope these days. So I do cling to that. I really do find it a very powerful antidote against kind of Malthusian despair or, learned helplessness where you feel nothing, that we're doomed. I think this is kind of an anti-apocalyptic thinking. Culture works. We just have to understand it. We also have to understand that many local groups have co-created local cultures with animals. And we need to understand their side too. So sorry, very long answer, but it's really a profound point. It's what it all rests on. Yeah, sorry, I saw a hand from Susan. I don't know, am I allowed to do that?
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. But I
Oh,
see that
great.
in the chat, there is a question from Kim, which is related to what you were just saying about the baby elephants. So maybe you'd
Yeah.
like to respond to that first, and then
Ah,
Susan, you go next.
yes. Thanks, Kim. Kim, I should tell everybody, also works on elephants and is working on Topsy, the very, very famous elephant, and it's got lots of things on that. So very, very interesting. No, I don't think we can. I mean, Kim, obviously there are places like elephant rescue centers where there are dedicated, brilliant people doing the best they can to at least teach survival skills to elephants, even if the survival is learning how to survive next door to people. But I do think, as you say, our understanding of their world is necessarily anthropogenic. It's anthropomorphic. It's radically anthropomorphic. We will understand them only up to a point. And we need the older females. That's why when you do translocations, it is much, much better to move a family unit rather than a group of youngsters. It's intergenerational learning and cohort learning is important. So it has to be, several generations rather than just babies or just parents hoping that they'll breed. Although those are much easier things to do, it is not a good idea because, as you say, takes an elephant to teach an elephant to be an elephant. But I don't want to diss the work of people who really are running beautiful shelters in several places, Botswana, South Africa, up on the East Coast as well, who are doing the best they can with orphaned elephants. And, maybe that elephant will not be an elephant, but it'll be a human elephant, and at least there is the possibility. There are cases where people have succeeded in rewilding individual animals. One thinks of, the classic cases like Elsa the lioness who was rewilded, and it is of course possible. Baboon rehabilitation places do it all the time, and they're really careful not to habituate the little animal to human society. But it is different with elephants because they are like us, long-lived, and it takes long to teach them. So it's not as easy as with an animal like a baboon or a vervet monkey. Thank you for the question. Sorry, Susan.
Yeah, I found the section on animal cultures very interesting. And I wanted to ask you, when people talk about African elephants or Indian elephants or frame them as such, do you think there is some kind of hidden understanding about positioning them like that, about their animal cultures? Or would you think, or are you arguing that the animal culture is distinct from something that is to be understood geographically, that is to be framed in relation to a particular nation state? And related to that, my second question was about whether animal cultures also presume some kind of animal subjectivity, while while we trying to write histories about them, we can write about what's happening to them. Uh, is there a hidden assumption about their inner worlds also?
All right, I'm going to ask you when I come to the second question, to just unpack for me the hidden assumption thought, but I just want to quickly think with you about the first question. So, so often in the past, and maybe we all had this in our sort of children's books. Oh, Indian elephants are like this, but African elephants are like this. And in fact, if you look at some of those children's books sort of through our critical eyes, and not just children's books, also, like teenage, young adults, the Willard Price books, so often we saw the same discourse that was visited upon the sort of two subcontinents by imperial fantasies. Oh, no, the Indian one, look, you can work with it, you can civilize it. As long as you bring British culture, this is going to work. You can tame them. They're going to work for you. They can work with you. Really, these ones can be perhaps, part of the scene. They're going to work. The African ones were always seen as too wild to be tamed. Not always. There were a couple of administrators who thought, no, they should be made responsible members of society, especially administrators who'd served in India and thought they could help with the logging in the Neisner Forest, for example. So the same framing that is visited on particular nation states by the imperial fantasies of personhood are also visited upon the animals, unsurprisingly to us. The same cliches are put upon the animals. However, I also do not deny biology and reality and how animals evolve for different situations. So it may be that there are, and we know there are morphological differences between the elephants. In fact, it's more complicated than that. But okay, there are definitely some genetic differences that we can visibly see. Sure, there might be other differences, might be coming into must earlier or later. Who knows? These things must be evaluated. But that really does bring us to the idea about the nation state. Because the one thing that we historians know is that our discipline was built on the rock of the nation state. It was invented, really, Ronk and others to support the nation state. The paperwork comes from the nation state. And when we so often think in terms of the nation state. What is so liberatory and refreshing and frankly decolonial about animal history is that the animals don't care about that sort of border. And if you're going to take animal history seriously, you're going to have to look at least sub-regions rather than just countries. So I think that social scientists and historians of the global south are very sensitive to place. Let me give you an example, Susan. When I wrote, it's a very self-indulgent example, so just forgive me. But when I wrote my book long ago when I was young and the earth was very different, it was called The Horse in South Africa or something, or Riding High, Horses, Humans and History in South Africa. And South Africa, the nation state. With great confidence, however, someone from the global north wrote a book on horses called The History of the Horse, which was the history of the horse in one particular part of their country. But you see the difference, like great confidence. This is a metonym that stands for the whole. And I often think that global south scholars are a little bit more sensitive to the nuances of place. So we're very, very careful about not doing that sort of thing. Hello, Nancy. And I quite like the fact that you brought up the nation state, because lots of people here have worked on animals and have been compelled to get out of comfort zones, me too, and do things that are much more like regional, or like Nancy, following parrots obsessively around the world and like a global diaspora, because the animal body is traveling and just forces you to not be a historian of the nation state. I think it's incredibly liberating. It's also a lot of work and terrifying, but those things are nice. Okay, so there was that. Then the second question, about subjectivity and agency and the hidden assumption. Tell me more about the hidden assumption there. What is the assumption?
Yeah, this is something I've been wondering about, whether to write a history of animals, you have to be sympathetic to certain beliefs, like you might believe that there is an animal subjectivity, or that there is an animal perspective. And just like we can't really ever know what a person is thinking or know definitively about their internal minds, we can't know about an animal's inner world that way either. So I was thinking about whether the animal culture, or the way you put it, is a manifestation of some kind of animal subjectivity.
And a lot of it might be our own kind of projection. And we have to really watch ourselves there. I once tried to do an experiment on this and try to write the history of horses, not from the view from the saddle, the way, in the past, but really try to see through the eyes of the horse. But so it was a story about sex and grass and running, but it's really just a projection of my own fantasies about what it must be like to be a horse. It's a useful exercise, but it doesn't really get us into breaking the assumption that you're talking about, because it's just like a Rorschach test, an
No,
ink
but
blot test for historians.
I don't mean assumption in a critical sense, but that we are able to access the human subjectivity in different ways,
No, I know
right?
what you mean.
Like, through human suffering, for instance.
Of course. Yeah. I take assumption. No, I don't take it as a critical thing. It's just a problem we're all working on. The comforting thing is that all historians are working on it. You know, even to have a theory of mind for how the ancient Romans saw the world, well, that's tricky too. And the only thing we have to be careful of is ventriloquizing, like really making our historical subjects mysteriously talk just like us. So we think of the otherwise pretty fabulous British social historians. Mysteriously, they're peasants from many hundreds of years ago talk an awful lot like left-wing Marxist history professors. You know, that's the kind of thing all historians deal with. So I'm not unduly held back by my failure to understand a theory of mind for the other that I'm talking about. Because I'm not talking for them, I'm talking about them. And I'm very clear on that point. So, of course, we cannot reach them. And it's even harder to understand an octopus than it is to understand the Romans. Obviously, it is. So we work around it. We do as historians have always done. We're careful not to ventriloquize. We're careful not to impose a Rorschach test on these creatures. And we do as much as we can by hanging out with the creatures. Now, Michael was here. I'm not sure if Michael's still here. I can't see the people. But Michael Glover did a lovely PhD on cattle. And part of his methodology, like it is for many of us, Nancy's done it as well. Andrea really has done it. Lots of people have done it. Hanging out with the creature. You hang out with the animals, baboons, lions, hang out with porcupines. You hang out with horses. You hang out with dogs. And that's great because that does teach you a little bit about the real living, breathing creature, watching, trying to develop a theory of mind. And developing a theory of mind is obviously, you can call it that if you're a philosopher. Historians would just call it empathy, which is not the same as sympathy, but empathy. But if we do that, and we can try to do it by being with the methodology of simply being with the creatures, much as we would when we're doing interview groups with human beings. The thing to remember, the caveat to remember, is that we only know those baboons or those police dogs. We do not know all dogs for all time. Of course we don't. And we cannot even know what the parents or the grandparents of those elephants were like. We can only understand how these ones are interacting with us, because the danger is then to make like a sort of stereotype of the animal as an organic elephantness, as though all elephants are like this for all time. And even though we might know those ones really, really well, it cannot tell us more than that. So I just want to put that caveat in because I'm a big believer in just hanging out with animals. It's really helpful, but only up to a point. And so, you know, I just wanted to put that caveat in as a methodological issue. And no, I'm very excited about it. I didn't take it as critical at all. You know, I agree with you. We, of course, go in with these assumptions. We also have to do it. We can't just throw up our hands in despair and say, well, we'll never understand these animals, and then not even try. I'm okay with coming in as a human being and going in like that. And the reason why I'm okay with it is twofold. First of all, we have to do something, as I say. But secondly, it's actually, I really think it's something we have co-evolved to do. If you look at the longue durée, and I'm talking seriously longue durée, then I think you'll find that our species survives by trying to get into the minds of other species. Hunting, as part of hunting and gathering, or gathering and hunting as we now prefer to say, to hunt, you have to get, or at least try to get, radically into the mind of what the other animal is doing. And I think there's been some beautiful field work on Kusan indigenous hunter-gathering groups in Southern Africa, where, you know, they'll interview hunters even now. And luckily, there's still people who are practicing pretty radical, you know, subsistence hunting. And so some of the stories really help you understand what it is to get into the mind of the other if you're reliant on killing and having that animal be consumed by you. It's a kind of radical empathy that historians can only emulate. And they'll tell you stories like hunting the springbok, the sort of iconic Southern African buck. They will then feel what it feels like to be a springbok. They will feel the dark stripes come on the face. They will feel the thudding of the heart. They will feel how the blood drips down their legs when they actually do shoot a springbok with a bow and arrow. So that kind of thing, of course, they're feeling as a person, but it's intensive and good ecological knowledge, coupled with the desire to understand which way the springbok is going and why. So it's not like animal history is that new. Maybe it's the oldest art.
Um, You've also written, Sandra, about the methodological challenges that multi-species historians such as yourself face. You've mentioned how the archival material is, of course, all anthropocentric, and older, more traditional or conservative approaches cannot be used for writing multi-species history. I wanted to ask you to talk a bit more about what sort of a fresh approach you found it necessary to develop for the purposes of writing this book. And there was something in there that really spoke to me personally, which is what you call spending time with other than human subjects as a part of the methodology of writing about or writing an animal sensitive history and writing it authentically. Um, I had somewhat of a similar experience a few years ago, which I'd like to quickly tell you about to explain why this speaks to me so much. Like I mentioned, I teach German literature, and it's taught to people whose first language is not German, and they've all learned the language. They're still struggling with it at the point where we start reading literary texts. And a few years ago, a few things happened. We happened to be reading a novel written by an Austrian writer, which is about a woman, the last survivor after an unnamed apocalypse, who's stuck somewhere in the mountains and has to learn to survive. And all she has with her are a bunch of animals. There's a dog, there's a cow who's pregnant, so there's a calf soon, there's a cat who has babies, etc. And so the novel is a complete rumination on, of course, what it is to be human and what it is to live with animals. And I had chosen that novel for the course because I wanted to introduce a certain amount of animal studies into the reading of German literature. And initially, I found that the students were not really into it. I mean, A, they struggle with the language, so anything is uphill. And B, it was like they'd be fidgeting, they'd be looking out of the window, looking at their watches, and sometimes asking me, is this a canonical text? Why are we reading it? And stuff like that. And at some point of time, I had just adopted a new puppy and I had dogs at home and there was no one else around. So I had no choice but to start taking the puppy with me to work for about a week or 10 days. And that changed everything in the classroom because we were talking about this text, which was about what it is to be with animals, particularly with a dog as well. And suddenly it seemed to become real and relatable to the students. And I noticed how much of a shift there was in their attentiveness, in their interest for what we were talking about. And as a next step, then eventually we decided to shift out of the classroom, which I always find extremely anthropocentric as a space, and to go and sit outside the canteen on a few benches under a tree. And there are street dogs around, there are birds around, there are bugs around. And it just became so much easier to talk about that text with nobody getting bored that I really thought, yeah, this works. This is what one has to do. If one wants to talk about what it is to live with animals, one has to make it happen in a visible way so that one can then talk about it. And I wanted to ask you, I'm really curious to know how spending time with other than human animals shaped your research and writing.
Well, okay. I mean, jeepers, there's a lot happening there. And don't think I didn't notice and appreciate your use of the word ruminate in this context. Very clever, very clever. I like. So, I mean, gosh, where to begin? First of all, on the power of bringing the animal in, of the more than human classroom, I think this is profoundly important. If we're going to be teaching this, a lot of people here are already doing it. And I'm seeing a lot of friends here. Anastasia, I also see you. Hello. The power of just bringing the animal in. Personally, I believe this is very important, even if you are not doing multi-species history. I have always, for the last 20 years, brought my animals to campus. So I used to do therapy dog for the students who are very anxious before exams or who have eating disorders. Although one of them did say, gosh, I already have a stress disorder, and there's Professor Swart and a 50-kilogram dog. So, really, but now I just bring my Jack Russell and I see the students pass him around the class. And as he gets more and more bitey, they pass him faster and faster and faster, like a game of hot potato. But I also do a sort of more serious thing with animals, and that is at the military academy. In order to teach the young we've got a military academy attached to the university. And in order to talk about the body language that the young officers have to portray in the world, and they really have to understand body language. It's a matter of life and death for them to read a person or to portray themselves in the correct, unequivocal fashion. We find that just giving them the lecture really doesn't work. What does work is giving them the lecture with horses. First of all, you really have to concentrate to not be crushed. And secondly, they can immediately see, because the horses are much, much better teachers than we are, because a horse reacts instantly and honestly to body language. They can't hide anything. So there, the horse, the animal itself, seriously, I don't mean it as a metaphor, the horse becomes the teacher. So there, that was the most dramatic I've seen of the power of the animal in the classroom, the power of the horse. I want to take this course that we do for the military academy, and I'm thinking I should do a course, and some of you will be interested in this. Andrea, listen, Boss Mare, where you teach anyone on campus who wishes to use their body to convey messages in an unambiguous, unequivocal fashion to the world, and to use your body as powerfully as you can. And I want to use my two mares to do the teaching. Anyone wants to come in on me with that, talk to me, because I'd love to do a sort of like a workshop that we can transfer elsewhere to teach people to do that. So thank you for, what you said about bringing the dog to the little puppy to the class. I believe in the power of that. I was also amazed. That was all very happy. This is not very happy, what I'm going to say now. I was amazed, shocked, and saddened by the alienation of my students from nature. In fact, I look out the window, I see mountains. I'm in a little university town where it's in vineyards, mountains, there are Cape leopards in the mountains. I've seen a caracal, our red lynx, very close to my home. There's baboons, there's deer, there's porcupines, there's cobras. It's wonderful. My students can't identify these creatures. They believe crazy things about these creatures when they think of them at all. They're so alienated from the natural world. I don't think they could name 10 bird species. And I don't really know why that is. And all students across the board, all different cultures, classes, whatever, they're really alienated. We're losing generational knowledge of animals at an unprecedented rate. I think this is extremely dangerous. It's a kind of baseline amnesia. So they don't know when we lose nature because they don't know what the ecological assemblage was in the first place. It's remarkable to me. And I think we need to actively address this as educators in the social sciences. I don't think we need to worry about those people doing biology or zoology. That's covered. But how could we produce graduates who are this alienated from the broader ecology in which they live? I think we need to think about this. I'd love to talk to this group about that a little bit more. But that really is a problem, because in this alienation lies a loss of kinship, a loss of empathy, a loss of, Susan, that theory of mind, the being with, the hanging out that you brought up now as well. There's so much that is lost. But I also noticed that with some academics, because there's a sort of schism. I don't know what the rest of the people think here. I'd be very interested to know. But there's a sort of divide, a sort of chasm between, and it's among academics who look at the human-animal connection in the social sciences. There's a kind of divide between those of us who are living with animals, completely, And those people who feel that there should be a complete divide, there should not be horse riding, there should not be dogs living with people or cats living with people, that there should be no connection, that there should be a severance, that animals belong in game reserves, or they belong to be free, they don't belong to interact closely with people. They would find it anathema that I ride a horse. They would find it anathema that you own a pet dog, or however you want to say, live in your multi-species family, however you want to say it. They would find it really unethical. And I think a lot is lost then if you take that position. And the reason why I say it is, it really takes us, to me, back to a kind of pre-Darwinian world in which kinship, a close kinship with other animals, is not recognized. That's how I feel. And I think we lose a lot of knowledge that way, not to mention a lot of joy. I can't imagine a different sort of family.
I thought it was really nice how you use the word environmental amnesia to talk about this amnesia that you've been talking about right now. And I kind of also feel that besides the two extremes of, or let's not call them extremes, but let's say between talking about the divide between people who live with animals and, of course, share space, lives, emotions, days with them, and the other people who sort of say there shouldn't be any of this, that it's wrong. There's also a third sort of category that I come across more and more, which I find actually scarier or more alarming, and that is the people who don't see them at all. In the sense that that was the thing that I was facing with my students initially, the
Yes.
animal side. And we live in a country where, just like the situation that you've described in your book, we are not separated from animals visually or whatever. When you're out on the streets, you are around them. Whether you have a companion animal at home or you're just out on the streets, and there are multiple species walking around, flying around, and to be blind to them, to not even notice their presence, or to see them as not very different from, I don't know, a little stone lying on the street or something that you sidestep, but which is not a being for you. I find actually that position more more alarming somehow, because it shows
Yes.
how blinkered we've become, and how
Yeah.
anthropocentrically blinkered, so that others are not even visible anymore. But I see Andrea has raised her hand. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. And thank you for this great seminar. Sandra, always lovely to hear you, see you.
Lovely to see you.
I have to say I have not had the opportunity to read this book, but I can never pass up an opportunity to attend a seminar with Sandra Swart. So I'm here anyway. And I think it's fabulous. As you know, I'm a bit of a methods nerd these
You
days.
are.
And I just love how you talk about hanging with the animal. I mean, there's a lot of hanging around anthropology that's been going on for a while. So I love that. And that combined with the boss mare methodologies to come, super exciting. And I want to, well, first just quickly, I really agree that that's one of the big challenges we have to go forward in this field, in not the least in academia, is this divide between not just abolitionist stances and others, but like all this ideas of, shall we relate at all to animals, and can we not, and how do we do it when we do? And I think there's a really interesting possibility to look into the premises with which we think. I think there's a lot of hidden premises that neither of us are probably aware of yet. So I see that as an exciting challenge, and something I hope to dive into coming years. But my question is here on methodologies, of course, and I don't know if you use that word in this book, but I seem to remember you talking elsewhere about doing ethnography in the archives. And I was just wondering if you would speak a little bit to that, like how, like that's kind of maybe methodology. What is it you do when you do that? And what other creative methods might you be practicing that might not come through the final pages? Not all of them do. often.
No, absolutely. No, thank you so much. Lovely to see you. It's always lovely to see you. And we must talk about the boss mayor thing, because I think we'd have a lot of fun putting something together. But okay, I just want to quickly just pick up on one thing that you said before we got onto the sort of methods thing. And that was, and it's also picking up on the third position, you know, the blindness, the not seeing, the just not allowing you into sort of the intellectual ocular space. You don't even see them. And then there was sort of a fourth position that I didn't even mention, but it is a position. And that is a bizarre new position, the kind of mousebound position of animals can be fixed. Here they are eating one another. If only we could change that. They are not behaving as we would wish. And that also speaks of a kind of a real lack of understanding of how animals are in the world. And sometimes I think it's not intentional, but sometimes I think there's also when people take an extreme position like that of the severance between people and animals, it also feels to me, and I think you all kind of probably, I mean, I don't know what you think, but I think that it can be a little bit disrespectful to indigenous cultures and who live very, very closely with animals and have many interesting ways of coexisting with them that then are sort of like erased and sort of hectoringly lectured to that they may not interact with animals. And in fact, this seems to me to be quite a problem. So I just wanted to flag that when we're making our hierarchy of the ways we interact with animals in academe, in our minds, and the assumptions we go in with, to pick up on what Andrea and Susan said, like our incoming premises. I think that's one of the problems as well, that we need to, you know, we need to take that more seriously, and anthropologists are just the people to help us with that. So, you know, just wants to flag that as one of the things in the 4 different approaches. So yes, no, I very consciously and a little bit annoyingly to some people like to say it's a kind of ethnography, but a historical ethnography. And the idea is to look at how change happens in cultures over time. And why I like that is because ethnography always looks at the specificity of location. You know, people can disagree on ethnography. You know, you get 3 anthropologists in a bar, there'll be 4 different opinions and 3 fistfights. But what the one thing they agree on is that location is everything. Context is king. And so I love that because that's the intersection with history. So if we're going to take cultures seriously, which we are, and we're going to take location and context seriously, which we are, ethnography is the word for it, man. So I like that, and I use it on purpose. And how are we going to reach it? There's never going to be the archive of your dreams. So you go to war with the army you have, and the archive we have is flawed and broken and colonial, and we know all this. But it's not bad when it comes to certain animals and discussing different cultures of being with those animals. Like, for example, many different archives will have wonderful and detailed reports of dealing with rogue animals. Normally, it's the problem animals that make it into the archive, but that does give you a sense of how, say, herds people, for example, are living closely with elephants or lions, either apex predators or animals that then maraud into crops and things like that. So I think that gives you a kind of, I can't imagine a different word for it, but a kind of co-created shared culture of being in the world, because the administrators will say, look, you know, really these lions are coming for the cattle, but we notice what they do is they move the cattle into a boma at night here in this village, and the lions seem to respect that. Here in this village, they don't do that. They do something else. They get the young boys to sleep on these sleeping platforms. That seems to be working for them there or not working for them there. So I like that because it gives us a sense of a co-created culture, often over time, that we find in the archive, partially and badly reported, but there. And I like it. And then I like the idea of, you know, ethology linking with this, because, you know, that's always been the study of animal behavior, but almost as though it is a pure thing that does not change over time and should not be seen through the lens of human interaction. So I like this because it disrupts the idea completely and forces the category to interact with this ethnography, and bringing them together is what animal history should be about, I think. I don't know what you think about that, but I suspect you're on board for it.
And me, I think that sounds fantastic. I just love the idea of finding specificity and
Yeah, that's it.
yeah,
That's it. You know, we
and
find
on
the
the
idea of
content.
you go for that context, and this, as in everything, is king.
Yeah, I can really see you hanging out there with the animals also in the archive.
There's a lot of horses in the archives, but when you look for a porcupine, but as Anastasia says, this is common for archives. Conflicts are archived. Everything goes well, it doesn't leave a paper trail. That's why everyone always talks about war. My goodness, wars are easy to talk about, aren't they? It's peacetime that no one writes down. Absolutely. It gets a little hard from me because I couldn't agree more. And this creates quite a skewed version of what's going on. Like in the book, Andrea, I'd love you to read it. You need to read this because I want your feedback. Anastasia as well. I think Michael's probably read it. Kim, you, all the people, because there's a wonderful case study that is offered in the book about lions coexisting up in Naina in Southwest Africa, now Namibia, in this very arid corner of the world. And what was happening is lions and people had reached a serious accommodation of coexistence. And when this was seen by the initial anthropologists, they were American. They had no idea that this was unusual. So they thought, oh, well, you know, this is what happens with lions and people. No, they'd actually reached over, because of the stability of the region and the ability to share the time more or less evenly, 12 hours, 12 hours. There was a complete kind of accommodation between the lions and the people. And the people, there were rules to dealing with lions. Like, for example, you would give some of your kill to the lions, leave that for them. That was correct. But equally, you could take a lion's kill and you would say to them, old ones, this meat is mine. And you would take it, but very respectfully, not attacking. Astonishingly, when they did a survey of the deaths in that area, I mean, it's right up there by Etosha, but the deaths in this area were vanishingly few. Over the period of a century, there were 2 or 3 deaths because the people had learned to use their bodies correctly with the lion. If you saw a group of lions, you'd move away, don't make eye contact, move away in a diagonal. Interestingly, lions do that too. When a lone lion stumbles on a group of people, also look away, drop your eye, move away at a diagonal. Don't, you know. So they'd learned, and then they'd learned to do basically work in shifts. Lions took the night shift, people took the day shift completely. Now we know that we're diurnal creatures. We tend to be more alive in the day. Normally, lions are more active at night, but here it was a complete severance. You would not do other stuff at night. So it was this accommodation of cultures that they'd co-created. In Etosha, where, as you know, they did fortress conservation, so they ripped the people out of the area, and the lions were now like in this sort of barricaded place. They only interacted with tourists. The lions were absolutely deadly. In fact, people coming seeking shelter, crossing the border, they would be wiped out by these lions. Not that they were like man-eaters in that sort of 19th century sense, but opportunistically, the lions would definitely prey on people if they were there, and the people didn't know how to interact with them either. So, and that's right there. There's nothing different in the genetics of those lions at all. But context is here, like almost on a very granular level, because it's abutting each other. And the lions and the people have created these two almost antithetical cultures, you know? And I found that sort of thing extremely powerful. And that's beautifully archived for us, and literally by anthropologists in this particular case. So you know, here we are. It doesn't make sense. I mean, you know, this is where we can get the good stuff, the meat. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, of course, Anastasia is correct. It's conflicts. Peace very seldom hits the archive. But I think, you know, since we sort of just, you know, bringing this up, everyone's talking about rewilding, and it's a very sexy term. It's a very interesting concept. But I think at least part of the southern form of rewilding would be thinking about ancient ways of coexisting with different species or ecological assemblages or multi-species, you know, packages. And looking at how people in that area in the past have lived with animals rather than, you know, just being in conflict with them, and taking it a little bit more seriously and trying to find out how they did it. And I think that could be a southern form of rewilding, because learning from the past, particularly indigenous ideas and of how to live with, would be a way of helping us with current conflicts, like the baboon conflict, where I live in Cape Town. People are at war with the baboons, and there's a lot of ways we can learn to live with each other that's there in our cultural reservoir. We just need to find it and then spread it.
I still have a whole lot of questions, Sandra, but
Oh,
we've run out of
sorry.
time. So
Oh,
maybe
no.
I'll just ask you a last question
Yes,
before we
sorry.
then all have to leave. And I'm wondering which one to ask. But what you just said about rewilding, I just want to say something very quickly about that and then go to my question. Because we just had a short while ago a conference that we've organized along with Dominic O'Keefe from Sheffield. And it was about conservation politics in India, about Project Tiger making it to 50 years. And there, the concept of rewilding was also discussed uh, and questioned. The term wild was questioned. And it was posited, of course, that the wild or the notion of the wild is itself such a construct. So how can one speak about rewilding? And maybe I'll leave it up to you whether you want to respond to that or to my other question, which is about the concept of agency, which is something that we've talked about in practically all our table talks. Um, of course, for
Yeah.
what you've written, agency, recognizing non-human animal agency, um, is intrinsic. And you've pointed out, of course, as well, why and how it is usually not recognized as agency. So I just wanted to ask you how you or any other multi-species historian or scholar from any discipline for that matter would define agencies so that non-human subjectivities are not rendered invisible or they don't remain unrecognized.
Okay, this is great. This is a great way to end. And also, thank you so much, all of you. This has been really lovely for me. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Wow. Okay, so I've got no problem with the word wild. In fact, my Twitter handle is wild pasts. I embrace it. I love it. So I reject that hypothesis and go straight on to agency. And I'm pretty excited to chat about agency. I mean, we could talk for days about agency. The only thing I want to say is that I think the agency war is over. I think we mustn't fight it anymore. Obviously, there is agency. What is now interesting is where do we go from there? And of course, this is something we see in other facets in history. I'm an Africanist historian. For a long time, there would be these beautiful, nuanced works. Nancy got me onto a lovely article by Lynn Thomas, which said, stop proving the obvious. Don't have these beautiful, nuanced, complicated papers. And then the little tiny little tagline is, and so we can see these people had agency. No, of course they had agency. You're doing so much more. You're doing yourself a disservice by making this the sort of tiny little stumpy tail that wags a beautiful dog. Don't do that. And the same thing with animal history or animal studies, human animal studies. Let's stop fighting the agency war. You know, no one's going to win it. Those who really can't see the agency that is so manifestly there, even if you just have a pet dog, you know this dog has agency. It is so blindingly obvious that there's almost something else happening there. So I want us to stop trying to convince, because there's only so much energy in the world. It's a zero-sum game. Let's rather do something much more interesting and see how that agency plays out in different ways, how it's understood contemporaneously in different ways, and so often clearly understood by people, but responded to very, very differently. And here, of course, it's our rogue animals, Anastasia, that get all the heat, you know, because they demonstrate too much agency. But it tells you a lot about how people are thinking at the time. It's a wonderful historical lens. So really, that's all I'm saying. Agency obviously exists. Let's do more interesting things with it, you know.
Thank you. That's a lovely way to put an end to the debate and to bring today's conversation to a close as well. Thank you so, so much, Sandra. This was absolutely a pleasure. I've had a lot of fun. I hope you've too. And I hope everybody else who's made the time to be here today enjoyed this as much as we did. I wish you all
I
a
really,
great
really loved it. This is a great gang, and I really enjoyed myself. Thank you so much for listening and for being part of it.
we look
Thank you.
forward to your next book then.
It's coming, I promise. It's on baboons. Just wait.
Right. So
Oh,
everybody have a great day or a great evening. Bye-bye.
yeah.
Thank you
Bye.
so
Thank you.
much. Bye.
Bye.